As the administration gets closer and closer to a decision on whether or not to forgive, or shall we say wipe out, all those student loans, billions of dollars, what am I talking about? We're talking trillions of dollars worth of loans. We're taking a look at why, number one, the cost of education is so high, and what forgiving all these loans would mean from an economic, from a social, and from a political standpoint. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Trish Regan Show. Good to have you here. I am Trish. A reminder, the portions of today's program, they are brought to you by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals than right now. So go to legacypminvestments.com for more. Again, that's legacypminvestments.com for more. Plenty of inflation, of course, to worry about. Gold comes in handy, considering. Anyway, I want to go to this Wall Street Journal headline that they are billing as an exclusive. We've certainly heard a lot of rumblings about Joe Biden making this decision as we get closer to the elections this fall. In this case, the headline is Biden's student debt decision expected later this summer. Apparently, he's been kind of punting, right? Because he's getting kind of nervous because he's trying to weigh the political consequences. It would be nice if he weighed the economic ones as well. I'm going to get into that. But the political consequences could be actually perhaps unintended, right? I mean, he thinks he's doing a good thing. He's mobilizing the base. He's getting younger people like AOC's crowd and the Bernie bros jazzed because they may get forgiven some of their student loans. But what about everybody else out there, right? What about everybody else that did things the right way, the hard way, and maybe worked a few jobs to send their kids to school, scrimped and saved everything they could over the years to send their kids to school, and then they actually get nothing here. In fact, if anything, they're on the hook for all those people that kind of, you could say, sort of abused the system, right? Not that the system didn't abuse them as well, and I'm going to get into that because college costs are way out of control, and basically that's been self-inflicted from, frankly, government policy that was intended to do one thing and wound up doing another. Anyway, he's got to weigh this out because he's already struggling in terms of his polls. We're seeing now that just 23% of the country thinks he's doing a good job. Brand new poll that just came out today. We have it on my website, by the way. If you're not on Trish Intel, Trish, Intel, Intel.com, please make sure you go and check out the website. You can sign up for my newsletter there. We have all the biggest stories of the day. But anyway, he's got to weigh this right now because there's a lot of Democrats and a lot of independents with whom this move may not sit so well. In other words, there could be some significant political fallout of people saying, well, that's not fair. You know, I worked so hard to put myself through school, or my parents worked so hard, and you know, what's it for? It's that kind of moral hazard argument that they use in economics sometimes. But I want to take a step back in today's program, and I want to look at just exactly how on earth we wound up with education rates that are through the roof. I was looking at tuition numbers, 1,375%. That's how much tuition has grown at four-year colleges here in the United States since 1978. Wow. This would be a good day for a gold commercial again. But I mean, just think about that, 1,375% since 1978. That's how much education has gone up. And you say, well, why is that? Well, one, everybody wants to get a college education right now because, you know, society's been taught you can't do anything without a college education. But in actuality, that's not true. I want to share with you a study, an analysis from the New York Federal Reserve that found 4 out of 10 recent college graduates are now in jobs that don't even require college degrees. And that's if they're working, period, right now. I get it because you know, unemployment being as low as it is, some of these kids just don't want to work. But anyway, I found that amazing. 4 out of 10 recent college grads are in jobs that don't even require college degrees. Meanwhile, when they do require degrees, even advanced degrees, like how about this, law school, they're not really making enough to make up for the cost of the degree itself. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal last summer that I think was quite telling, because it looked at actually a law school, University of Miami Law School, and examined how much the students were borrowing. $163,000 is what these kids were borrowing, and then 2 years later their earnings were $59,000 a year or less. And they pointed out that that's actually the biggest gap between debt and earnings among the top 100 law schools. So $163,000 in debt, you're making $59,000 a year. You got to say, was it worth it? I mean, I think that we need a little bit of reality check, and that people have to be saying, is it worth it? Should I be going to law school? Should I be going to a 4-year institution? Or maybe I should do something else. And for whatever reason, and again, I know the reasons and I'm going to share them with you, but for various reasons, I should say, we as a society have made this decision, oh, you got to go to college. And we've kind of pushed this on society, and consequently, you got young kids that are paying $75,000 or borrowing $75,000 a year with room and board and tuition, and they're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing, or their families are borrowing, and there's no real way to pay it back. And so we've created this institutional class that frankly is doing great itself, right? The universities are doing great. But what about the kids? And isn't it supposed to be about our students? I want to take a step back right now and just sort of explain how this all happened, because this was a product of a Democrat administration that really wanted to make sure everybody has access to education. I don't begrudge anyone that. It's just the way they went about it was really, really wrong. I'm going to get to that in a second, but I did mention inflation. You think about these college costs up nearly 1,400%, right, since 1978. It's one of the reasons why you need to think long and hard about what you're investing in right now. It's one of the reasons why I was so glad to have Charlie Dombeck on the program last week. In fact, if you didn't hear him, go back and listen to Friday's show, because he had some great ideas on how to invest in light of all this inflation and things other than the stock market. I think it's our go-to move, and we like equities obviously because they're very liquid and you can get in and out of the stock market. You get to see every single day where your money is, whereas if you invest in some other things, it's a little bit harder, maybe have a little bit longer of a time horizon. But his point was just that investors need to think about diversifying into some of these other asset classes right now, including things like real estate, and he had some good ideas on asset-backed loans as well. So I encourage you to check that out. That would be Friday's episode, and just lots of good things. So go check out Charlie Dombeck there. He'll actually be on the show, I think, later this week as well. So we will be talking to him again. But Key City Capital is the name of his firm. You can go look at it, keycitycapital.com/Trish, Trish. Give them a call. See if they can help you out. If you want to diversify maybe out of stocks, just a portion of your portfolio, right? I like the liquidity of the stock market, but I like also making sure that one has diversification as we go into these sort of uncharted waters. But let's get back right now to where the government went wrong in all this multiple times, over and over again, all the way back to 1965. They had the Higher Education Act. This was President Lyndon Johnson and Congress. They passed this thing, and they basically provided funding for the government to guarantee student loans that were made by banks. And in doing so, they shifted all that risk to the taxpayers. So it used to be banks would decide whether or not to loan a student money. And I understand. They said, wait a second, maybe that's not right, because then banks are going to look at what assets you have and what 18-year-old kid has any assets. And then they're going to look at family assets, and that's not really keeping with the American way, and that we want to enable everyone to have opportunity in this country. So the idea, I think, in theory, was a good one, except that the way this all turned out, the way it sort of shook out, was that students were effectively getting a blank check, right? And anybody would write them, because you had Sallie Mae and in there basically enabling banks to borrow at very low treasury rates, and Sallie Mae then used the money to buy the loans from the banks, so the banks didn't hold this stuff. So they didn't have to worry about the credit risk. And that meant kids were handed, call it the equivalent of $20 million. Here you go, kid. You're all set. Here's the government paying the bill. Of course, you'll have to pay it back eventually, but Not everybody understands that. Moreover, I don't think necessarily everybody anticipates, right, what it's going to mean to pay it back. And it feels like all of a sudden you had this infinite amount of money chasing, frankly, very few schools, which is why you saw more and more schools, right? And schools got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they became competitive in some ways because they realized if they had the fanciest dorm or the fanciest cafeteria, that was really relevant to kids. You know, hopefully the education improved in the process. I would argue it didn't. And I would also argue you don't need the facility to have a great education. You just need good teachers, enthusiastic students, but you don't need the fancy new football stadium. And all of a sudden, all the money that was coming, frankly, from the backing of U.S. taxpayers was going into this system. And so they maximized tuition as much as they possibly could. There were no limits put on anything. So the government couldn't say, okay, well, you know what, you're not allowed to raise that, say, more than 1% or 2% above inflation in any given year. And so consequently, we now go back to, since 1978, college tuition prices have gone up 1,375%. I'm just blown away by that number. If there's nothing else you remember from this podcast today, remember 1,375%. So consequently, you created this whole massive industry, right, in these schools themselves. And that was a mistake. And so now we're in a situation where it turns out, guess what? A lot of these kids can't pay the money back. I mean, it's now becoming a societal problem because we're, and I say we collectively, the U.S. government, taxpayers, everyone who elected every one of these officials that was okay with this strategy, we're kind of digging these kids into debt, right, ourselves. And I'm a big believer in individual responsibility, but we've created a system where we've incentivized colleges to keep raising prices. We've taken the market sort of yin-yang normalcy, right, out of the equation because kids are like, well, whatever, I got a blank check. And so it becomes free money. And once these kids graduate, they're stuck with a giant disaster. They can't live and pay these student loans back. And so I understand and I empathize with what the administration would like to do. I don't think it's the answer, and I think we need to be more creative about this. But I understand that the pressure is real, that these kids are under, and that we're trying to alleviate in some way because it's a real drag on society. But it doesn't work like that, right? You still got to pay your bills. And what the moral of all this, the moral of this story is that we've got to change our system so that we are not just saying, hey, you go to college, but maybe, hey, you get a job in something else. Maybe later you go back to college. Maybe when you're a little old enough to understand when you're, signing on the dotted line, what that's going to mean. I think it's troubling too when you look at some of the young people that are graduating that do have these debts, but they're not going to work right now. Or they're going to work and then they leave and they file for unemployment. And we need a culture of hardworking kids. It's funny, I'll tell you a quick story. My weekend was made. This past weekend, someone came to my house, a young kid. He is going to be a senior this fall in the local high school. And he had this whole little pamphlet that he had printed out advertising himself as a babysitter and as a swim instructor and as a lifeguard if you were having a pool party or anything like that. And I thought, how great is that? And he's going door to door in the neighborhood, handing these things out. Good for him, a little entrepreneur in the making. And this is what makes this country work, right? We need more of that. We need young people out there working. We don't want them saddled with these debts, but somebody's got to sit down and have these hard conversations right now. When you sign up for $75,000 a year, you better make sure that you can make it back, right? So you can't graduate with a nothing GPA. In many cases, a lot of these students, and that's what's really tragic about it, they're not even graduating. It kind of feels like malpractice. Why are you lending money to kids that in many cases you may know already they don't have a shot at actually graduating? Maybe they can't do the work, but we're giving them money anyway because that's the American way? I don't think so. We've got to be more creative about this. I think there are other solutions. For example, we got to say to the colleges, look, you can't raise that much above inflation. Sorry, we're going to have something to say about this because it's you as taxpayers that are on the hook. So you don't get the benefits of the capitalist system here when we're the ones ultimately that will have to pay the price. And in this case, and when we're talking about roughly $2 trillion worth of student loans that could be defaulted on. I mean, those are some big numbers. Anyway, back to Biden and whether or not he's going to make this decision sometime in July or August. He is facing a real challenge. You got 40 million people right there, 1.6 trillion in federal student debt that are waiting to find out whether or not they're going to have any of this relieved. And while some of them may be psyched, a lot of others just won't. It is time for a total redo on this entire college, dare I say, scam. Anyway, it's so good to have you here. A reminder, make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast on video and on audio. I'm on Apple, iTunes, on Spotify. It would mean a great deal if you would go there, subscribe, give me a big thumbs up or 5 stars or however they do it there. I think it's a star rating on Apple, but it's great to have you here. Feel free to share the video and also talk to your kids or grandkids about the reality of college, how much money this is. If you're a young person yourself and you're thinking about how much you're going to be taking on, just realize that. Think about it. This is your future. And if you don't pay that money back, it's going to have some consequences. At least it should. And so you need to make sure that you are preparing yourself for the workforce of the future and make sure you can get a job. Or if you've been taking out $75K a year, you've got a path to planning that back. Thank you again for listening, everyone, and I will see you tomorrow.